Does renouncing U.S. citizenship make sense for the average American living overseas? That's a question that Forbes recently asked, and I'm going to share with you what they determined. But as someone who has renounced U.S. citizenship and as someone who talks to people who are considering doing the same, I'm going to share my thoughts right now. Does this make sense? The numbers recently came out, how many Americans are giving up their citizenship, and it basically tripled year over year. Now, that's not an entirely fair comparison because during most of the pandemic, you had a very small number of embassies and consulates that were actually accepting renunciation appointments. Some of them were just shut down entirely. Some of them were conducting other business and were open for other things, but just didn't really process renunciations. And I think that gave a lot of people pause. You saw articles all around the world in newspapers in Germany and Switzerland and all over the place talking about how Americans felt it was unfair. They didn't want to be part of the country. They didn't feel that the country was supporting them during the pandemic. They held citizenship elsewhere. Most of them were not people who were trying to reduce their taxes. They lived in high tax countries in Europe in many cases, but they just felt like they weren't getting their money's worth. It was too much hassle. They didn't want to be American anymore. And so now you're seeing renunciations pick up again. And the question is this something that the average American should consider? I'm going to share a Forbes article. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson, the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We are a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors, including Americans, legally go where they're treated best, lower taxes, diversify and protect your assets, obtain multiple citizenships, basically protect yourself. Whether you want to keep your citizenship, whether you want to change your citizenship, it's a very complicated question that we're going to talk about, but you can also learn more about that at nomadcapitalist.com, and we also host the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live. Anyway, let's get into the article from Forbes. When Boris Johnson, the now former British Prime Minister, sold his London home in 2009, he didn't pay any capital gains tax in the UK, but he was slapped unexpectedly with a U.S. tax bill. Many people don't know that Boris Johnson was actually born in New York. He left when he was, I think, about 5 years old. And because of that, unlike what you would see pretty much anywhere in Europe, he was a U.S. citizen merely for the fact that he was born on U.S. soil. Whether he would have lived till 5 years or 5 days on U.S. soil, he was born there. Place of birth in the United States means U.S. citizen until you renounce, and really you generally need to be an adult to renounce. And so he never did that. And then he went on his merry way, living in the UK, sold a home, had the personal residence capital gains tax exclusion, and didn't owe anything. But the U.S. government came and knocked on the door for their share because Americans are taxed no matter where they live. Interesting combination that you're born in the United States, you're given the citizenship, you can't even give it up for the first 18 years in most cases, and then, hey, capital gains, it's harder than business income to exclude on tax, and Boris Johnson found out the hard way. He's an accidental American, continues Forbes, a person who lived outside of the United States for the majority of their life, but holds U.S. citizenship because they were born there. Being American, unwittingly or not, comes with strings attached. As we say, Americans must report their global income to the IRS regardless of where they live. The United States is one of only 2 countries in the world, not entirely true, with a citizenship-based taxation system rather than a residence-based one, the other being Eritrea. Yes, Eritrea has basically a flat sum that you're supposed to pay. Nobody pays it. Go to San Diego, talk to the taxi drivers who are Eritrean. They are not paying. Many of them aren't aware of it. And is anybody really living in fear of Eritrea anywhere in the world? Probably not. Now, there are other countries that have kind of some de facto type of citizenship-based taxation, which is really residence-based taxation that follows you. So if you leave certain countries in Europe or even in Latin America, they may say for the next 3 years, you can't go to a tax haven or else we're going to keep taxing you, or we're going to impose some kind of restriction. Or if you're French, you can't move to Monaco and take advantage of their tax incentives. So those are some exceptions, but generally speaking, it's a lot more workable than just, hey, you're Boris Johnson, you've lived in the UK, you have no connection to the US other than you were born there, where you happen to get a passport that I don't think he actually physically even had it, by the way. I remember there was a time when he was flying from the UK to, I think, Mexico, and he flew through Houston. They wouldn't let him get on the plane because they said, where's your U.S. passport? You have to enter the U.S. As an American if you are a U.S. citizen, and it says right here in your British passport, U.S. place of birth. So unless you can show you gave up the U.S. citizenship at the time he hadn't, he had to rebook his entire flight at the last minute. And so basically, yeah, if you're born in the U.S., you're going to pay taxes on your London home when you sell it. And so notice there's no difference. Nobody was standing up and saying how unfair that was any more than people who were not accidental Americans, who were just regular Americans. The U.S. taxes people no matter where they live, and I don't think anyone really is concerned with the fact that they have an entirely different tax system than every other country on earth. Despite describing it as quote-unquote absolutely outrageous, Boris eventually settled his U.S. tax bill. He cut off any future hold the IRS might have had on him by renouncing his U.S. citizenship in 2016, and he was among 5,411 Americans to do so that year, a record number until 2020 when 6,705 renounced. And again, you saw a lot of downward pressure on that number because you just had, due to the pandemic, a lot of embassies that were closed or not taking appointments. Accidental Americans are not the only group that chooses to give up U.S. citizenship. The mega wealthy, like Bitcoin Jesus Roger Ver, from Nomad Capitalist Live 2021. Facebook co-founder and billionaire Eduardo Saverin are among those who released citizenship ties with the United States, as well as dual nationals with political ambitions in countries that don't allow for alternate nationalities. Yeah, I think the president or former president of Somalia, for example, renounced U.S. citizenship to become president. You're seeing more countries that are liberalizing dual citizenship. We just saw Liberia recently. Germany's in the process. Norway did it a while ago. Georgia not so long ago. But some of these countries still say, hey, if you want to hold political office, for example, in Armenia, you need to not be a dual citizen for X number of years before you actually run for the office. So the president of Armenia recently stepped down when it was revealed that he had citizenship at St. Kitts and Nevis. And that's a whole separate enjoyable story. If you want to hear about that, leave a comment below. But what about the average American abroad? What if you're not the mega wealthy? And by the way, I like the fact that they don't ask the Nomad Capitalist, who's also built a brisk business living outside of the United States. But an estimated 9 million other Americans live overseas. As tax laws become more onerous, as we've talked about, the U.S. can cancel your passport, refuse to issue you a passport. If you're living overseas, ostensibly you have a passport, but they can cancel your passport if you have a tax debt. Now, don't have a tax debt, but as I've always said, hey, you ever have a disagreement with the government? You ever have the government wasn't aware? This happened to lots of people where they send in the money to the IRS or they send in a tax return and it gets lost. And then imagine how they could come to play out. And so tax laws are becoming more onerous. They can take your passport. They're trying to find new ways to change the taxes, make it more difficult. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2019 about Americans who got stuck in a new tax regime because they were living in high tax countries where it was disadvantageous for them to cooperate with the U.S. tax system. But they had to do it. They had to do things that no other person in the U.K. or Germany, other countries in Europe would do that just didn't make sense in order to pay off a U.S. tax debt because the U.S. tax system often doesn't play nice with other tax systems. So does the U.S. care? No. Does the average American care? No. Make sure you pay your fair share because you're not driving in the roads, not using the bridges, not sending your kids to school. But it's really not about the roads and the bridges. It's about you need to pay because you're a rich jerk. So does renunciation make sense for the average, everyday American expat? That's the question from Forbes. And so we're seeing basically, they say renunciations of U.S. citizenship on the rise from 2005 to 9. Fewer than 2,500 people renounced. Less than 20. Should it be fewer, Forbes? I think it's fewer. My grandmother would always say it should be fewer. Between 2010 and 2020, the number went up to 36,840. So basically, you saw, I went to public school, but I think it's about a 13-fold increase. 6.5-fold increase with 5 years versus 10-year period, but big increase basically in how many people were giving up U.S. citizenship. Helping to explain that, says Forbes, is the introduction of the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act in 2010, which basically made, again, all these people living in countries in Europe where they were happily paying tax. It wasn't necessarily an issue in Dubai or in the Cayman Islands, but people who were living in Europe, paying taxes, having normal jobs, they couldn't get a mortgage, or their mortgage was canceled, or their bank account was closed, or their kid's savings account at the bank was closed. And so because of the new requirements that enforced laws that were already in the books, by the way, for you had to report foreign bank accounts, they beefed up the enforcement, and so it became very onerous. I can tell you this, I still have a property that is owned in a corporate structure that made sense for me as a U.S. citizen that nobody understands. When I go to do an audit in that company, when I have to deal with my annual obligations in the country where the property's in, like nobody anywhere, my own finance team in-house, nobody understands why I do this. Okay, my own in-house team understands when I explain it to them and they understand our business now. But nobody around the world understands, like, why would you structure this way? Well, because it made sense for someone who was a U.S. citizen. And so you find yourself doing different things. By the way, if you can't get a bank account, if you can't get a mortgage, if your child can't enjoy basic, savings account, if you have to, jump through hoops to structure the way you own your property or change the way you run your business, or maybe you've got a small business. It doesn't have to be a huge business. But we saw, again, Wall Street Journal article, 2019, lots of small businesses that were having to do all kinds of crazy things to comply with U.S. tax laws. And so you can imagine that this is why a lot of people living overseas, they don't mind paying tax. Now, there's nothing wrong with not wanting to pay tax. Obviously, we help people dramatically reduce their tax bills, including Americans. Even though you have to pay tax on a worldwide basis, you can use exceptions, exclusions, et cetera, to legally reduce the bill to, if not zero, in some cases, into perhaps the single digits. All right. And so everyone's situation is different. We're not giving tax advice. But Forbes continues that FATCA was designed to make tax havens harder to access and crack down on money laundering, and they did it. People who just wanted to live overseas, who happened to be Americans, who didn't want to live in the United States, were cracked down on. I will add, by the way, that for people who think, oh, if only we don't vote for Democrats, the Trump administration, you think America First didn't want people to come back to the United States? Do you think that America First supported people taking their talents to Switzerland and Germany and other countries, the UK? I talked to a number of people who, again, had normal high-paying jobs, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million a year, working in other countries, again, primarily in Europe, sometimes Singapore. And they said, I feel just as bad with America First, and the fact that I feel like the pressure is on for me to come back to the U.S. And if you're making good money and you're working in another country, you can imagine why Americans will want your talents in their country. But wasn't the point of the United States that you get to be an individual? Wasn't the point individualism and you get to make a choice and you weren't required to conform to the group? And yet, if you are an expat, if you're one of the 9 million expats out of 330 million people, you are not really treated that well. In the UK, they've got the expat section in the newspaper. There's no such thing in the United States. And so basically what Forbes says is Americans abroad aren't happy. They notice a survey that says 1 in 4 expats are seriously considering or planning to renounce U.S. citizenship. Okay, a lot of people are planning to do a lot of things. But what they say is the burden of U.S. tax filing is the top reason for this. And out of 3,200 expats in over 121 countries, 86% feel that their issues are less likely to be addressed by the U.S. government than those of stateside Americans. That is for sure. Nobody cares in a country of 330 million people that 9 million of you are such disgusting, despicable traitors that you would want to go somewhere else and live. Why would you dare leave the best country on the earth where you've got Waffle House, and you've got Starbucks drive-thru, and you've got Costco where they bring out pallets of those rotisserie chicken and they just shove it in the back of your big car? If you don't want that, how dare you? You should be ashamed of yourself. Isn't that kind of the attitude? And so you can imagine why someone like myself, for example, who already kind of didn't like living in the United States, who already felt like the culture was going the wrong direction, who felt like entrepreneurship and taking risks and that kind of stuff was increasingly being demonized, who just didn't necessarily agree with a lot of things about the country, who then wanted to go overseas, and they're like, we're going to keep our toxic clause in you. Is it really about reducing tax? Is it really about not paying? Because what I've said all the time is, for me, I legally paid either zero or very little tax in pretty much all the years that I was an American living overseas. So is it really about reducing taxes? It's not. It's about quality of life. And so I would argue, right, if you're an American, you can be an American living in the United States. And if you've got $1 million to put in, we've got banks that are in the UK and Switzerland and other places, Singapore. You can, even with less than $1 million, but with $1 million, you can really get a quality bank account that lets you make investments. They will take you as a U.S. tax resident. Many won't, but there are some that will do it, and they'll be happy to manage your money, because when you put in $1 million, some are $1.5 million, some are $2 million, $3 million, etc., hey, they'll take on the risk. Again, out of all the banks in Switzerland, there are a handful that we work with that are also halfway decent, because a lot of banks in Switzerland are overrated. But you don't even have to leave the United States to get that, okay? And so if you're an American living overseas and you are 7, 8, 9-figure net worth, hey, you want a bank account? Not only are there smaller bank accounts we've talked about, countries like Georgia, countries like Ecuador, it is becoming more difficult. Some countries in the Balkans are still available. A couple countries in Western Europe, Portugal is getting harder. Czech Republic has gotten harder, but it's doable, right? We help people with this all the time. So you can get those with, 1,000 up to 50,000. And if you have, 7 figures to put in, to deposit, to invest, you can get an account, American living overseas or not. And so when the question is the average American should they consider renouncing? If it's a quality of life issue, it's a financial services issue, if it's a diversification issue, if it's I don't want to be entirely tethered to the United States just because I happen to be born there, I want myself and my finances and my business and my freedom to be globally diversified, you could argue you're going to have a harder time as the quote-unquote average American that Forbes talks about. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should renounce your citizenship. It's a very personal decision, and many people want the idea of going back, and obviously what we counsel people through personally is we have all the different people in our stable that are tax and immigration and all the people we work with and saying, all right, here's the reality of what's going to happen if you expatriate. So it's not for everybody. But if you're looking at the fact that you're going to have a harder time accessing the stuff that wealthier people can get, even though their options are fewer, your options are even fewer as the average American. And so that's what makes it harder. And so I would argue that anyone who wants to live overseas and really doesn't need to go back to the United States could consider no longer being a U.S. citizen. And so Forbes talks about other unique aspects of being American. There's really not any country on earth where there's so many things that you have to do even when you leave. Well, hey, listen, after all these years that I've been gone, I look at it and I say, I put my libertarian views aside and I say, listen, the U.S. has high taxes. Not the highest in the world, but they're up there. Between federal and state and all the other stuff they throw at you, you're going to pay a lot. But you know, that's what it is. That's the deal. And if you stay there, you should pay. But you have options and you can leave. And again, you can dramatically reduce them. But why do you need to keep filing the forms? Why do you need to suffer? Why do you need to have all these impediments to your success overseas? Why do you have all these regulations and rules and reporting requirements that follow you? And so if that bothers you, if that offends you, if the culture of that only one country thinks that they can follow you around the world and tell you what to do merely for the privilege of being born on their soil, if that concerns you, then it's worth at least considering, what is my relationship with the United States? And so that's the question I would ask anyone, whether they're the average American or whether they are the 7- and 8-figure entrepreneur or investor that we talk to. What is your relationship? It's something we help people talk about all the time, help people come to those conclusions. And I think, quite frankly, again, the average American is probably going to have more problems than the wealthy American.